Hello everyone, you're very welcome to this EBD Academy webinar on improving your negotiating skills. Our speaker today is Eric Evans. Eric has a long career in negotiating major contracts. He's also the trainer for EBD Academy's course on a negotiation masterclass, improving the probability of success, which is running ahead of BioEurope Spring this year. Eric will be speaking for around about 30 minutes today. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the session, so you can submit those using the questions tab on your screen. Eric will also be talking about the negotiation profile tool in this webinar, and he'll be covering anonymous feedback for those of you who submitted your profile by the deadline during the course of this presentation. So with that, I'll hand over to Eric.
Thank you, Roisin. Good evening all. Welcome to this 30-minute webinar on negotiation and in particular how to improve your negotiating skills. I'd like to start with a fairly general comment, which is the first negotiation we ever do is the minute we're born and the minute we start crying. And from that point on, we tend to form habits, negotiating habits, as we go through childhood and into our work experience. And these habits that we form determine how successful we are. Now, I mention this because although many of us attend training courses in negotiation, the problem that we often have is that we've already formed some of these habits, which can limit the outcomes to the negotiations that we're involved in. And as I guess you all know, in the pharmaceutical industry, negotiations are getting tougher and tougher and tougher. Governments these days are taking more of a demanding role from pharmaceutical companies, even to the point where medicines which have been the subject of multi-million-dollar research programs are being declined by governments. Negotiations, of course, don't just go on with governments, they go on with civil servants, they go on with doctors, GPs, procurement people, and even with colleagues within our own organizations. And a few years ago, there were a number of articles which actually suggested that there are very strong correlations between the negotiation skills that we all have and the career progressions that we see. It was suggested that those of us who are very accomplished at negotiation are likely to make more progress in commercial careers. I mention all of this as an introduction because the key question which we inevitably face is, how good are we as negotiators? Have we thrown off some of the habits and practices we formed as children? Have we recognized that negotiating in a much tougher commercial environment needs higher level skills? Have we worked out that if we are to succeed in a commercial career, these negotiation skills need to be honed and developed? A survey was carried out by my company in 2005, which at its heart asked respondents how good they felt they are as negotiators. We got a surprising result, which was that 84% of respondents actually believe they're better than average at negotiation. It's quite staggering when you think of that. You know, you would typically expect a sort of 50-50 split around the average. What was even more interesting was that only 24% of adversaries were deemed to be better than average negotiators. It kind of suggests that people don't really have a benchmark, some sort of yardstick against which to measure their negotiating performance. And that led my colleagues and I to conduct a literature search on what it is that makes somebody an effective negotiator and what it is that makes somebody an amateur negotiator. And what I'd like to do now is just share with you one particular author and some of the things that this particular author has identified as things that make for success in negotiation. This is a well-published, well-publicized book. The guy actually says very early on in the first chapter, when it comes to planning for negotiation, I play it very loose. He says you can't be very imaginative or creative if you have too much structure in a negotiation. It's mostly about instincts. He went on to talk about negotiation strategy and says, I aim very high and then I just keep pushing and pushing to get what I'm after. Leverage, he suggests, don't make deals without it. He went on to say, once I've set my mind on a deal, I come up with at least half a dozen options, and I'll explain in a moment why I've put that in red rather than left it in black. On negotiating skills, and in particular improving them, he says, I think deal making is an ability you're born with. On relationships, when people treat me badly, I fight back very hard, even if it means alienating people. You know, just looking at some of these comments in a little bit more detail. Mostly, he says on planning, it's about instincts. Kind of implies or suggests that there's no development possible. I find that hard to accept. You know, if you think back to the time when you were an 18 or a 19-year-old negotiator, maybe negotiating with parents or friends or in an early role in your career, it's hard to accept that it's just about instincts and you have those instincts at 18 or 19 years of age and you don't actually develop them throughout your career. When it comes to strategy, the idea of keep pushing and pushing to get what you're after kind of suggests that negotiation is a power-based tool. I wonder how you react when people just keep pushing and pushing and pushing in a negotiation. Sometimes I think that can be very, very negative. Leverage, don't make deals without it, is a suggestion really that if you haven't got leverage, you can't get a good deal. You know, most of us when we negotiate with governments tend not to have a great deal of leverage. And if you work for a GlaxoSmithKline or a Pfizer or an AstraZeneca, you may well have leverage. Or if you have a patented product, you may well have leverage. But if you're not that big, or if you're selling generics, then often you're not going to have that leverage. So what's the answer? Give up? The reason I've highlighted this idea that once I've set my mind on a deal, I come up with at least half a dozen options is because there has been some very good research which suggests that some of the most successful negotiators are incredibly creative. This research by a guy called Neil Rackham, a behavioral psychologist, suggests that the average negotiator will often, in the planning stage, come up with maybe a couple of ways of solving a problem that he's about to negotiate. But the creative negotiator doesn't stop at a couple of options. He will quite simply come up with 5 or 6 options. And what this means is in the negotiation, if he gets no response from the first couple of ideas, then what he's able to do is turn to idea number 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. The final comment, when people treat me badly, I fight back very hard, even if it means alienating people. I really do think that this ignores the importance of relationships with our customers, and it actually builds on power as the main point in negotiation. Most of us, I believe, actually have long-term relationships with the people that we negotiate with. And the idea of alienating people in one negotiation, that can have long-lasting implications in terms of relationships. I have to disagree with an awful lot of what this guy says. Who was it? Some of you may have guessed. I honestly don't think that Mr. Trump has found the formula for success that will work for all of us. And as we went through this literature search, trying to identify what a good negotiator looked like, we came across an awful lot of authors who basically took the stance that I'm a brilliant negotiator, just do what I do and you'll be almost as good as I am. And I don't think, unfortunately, that's necessarily a recipe for success. It was round about this time that we were approached by a client, a major automotive manufacturing company, who asked us to define what the perfect negotiator looked like. And I have to be honest, we initially turned around and refused to do this piece of work. What we said to this company was that, look, we understand you're a global company. We understand the way that your people negotiate, but the way a major car manufacturer negotiates is not necessarily the same way that a pharmaceutical company or a services company or a bank will negotiate. And what we would really need to do in a study like this is to identify what is good practice, not just in one company, but across many different cultures. And by cultures, I mean national cultures, and I mean manufacturing versus service versus pharmaceutical cultures. Each of these sectors have different cultures. What the client asked us to do, therefore, was to put together some sort of benchmarking tool which would allow us to identify what an accomplished negotiator looked like, regardless of industry and regardless of nationality, and to put this together in a way that produced a tool that could be used in helping people to understand where they stood in terms of being an accomplished negotiator, what elements of their performance they might be able to improve, and what elements of their performance they should strengthen, even if they are pretty good. And the client asked us to do this work in association with other leading companies. So what we did, we actually started to approach a dozen organizations in total, different cultures, different industries, different nationalities, and we engaged with something like 200 people in some of these companies and maybe 50 people in some of the others to discuss what a really good negotiator looked like. If I give an example, we did a lot of work with Bayer, looking at something like 300 customer-facing staff, people who negotiated with governments, by which I mean politicians and civil service or public sector staff, who negotiated with consultants in hospitals and with procurement people and others throughout the organizations they were selling to. In all of this, we did pay attention to the difference in cultures, and we tried on a number of occasions to see if there were really significant differences between national cultures and pharmaceuticals and other industries. If I just take one example to try and bring this to life, we worked with an organization called Takeda, which is Japanese based, but they have operations in Japan, in USA, in Germany, and in France. And we looked closely at how different cultures within the organization negotiated. There are clearly differences between, for example, the Japanese culture and the American culture, even between the German culture and the French culture. And what we found is accomplished negotiators recognized these differences and tailored their approach to suit the particular culture they were dealing with. However, as well as these cultural differences, what we found was more agreement on key areas. And the tool that we eventually came up with, which most of you should have seen, was a tool which focuses on 5 key areas that unanimously across these 12 organizations, people believed was really, really important in moving to become a successful negotiator. So if I may take a few minutes just to focus on the 5 key areas, which you can see in blue around the outside of the circle, and the 30 individual activities that are a little bit closer to the circle. I'd like to spend a little bit of time just explaining the 5 key areas, and perhaps if there's time, pick up some of the activities and explain those. We did intend to try and give feedback to some of you on the profiles that you submitted at this webinar. But as Roisin said in the introduction, we've got something like 30 minutes, and we've got 200 plus people who've expressed an interest in this webinar. And to be honest, there are so many profiles, we wouldn't have time to go through a great number of them. So I've picked 5 out, and I want to spend a little bit of time just looking at 5 of these profiles and helping you to understand how to interpret them, helping you to understand what they mean in terms of becoming a more successful negotiator. First of all, a few words around the 5 key areas: approach, planning, control, relationship, and achievement. We find there are some people who really do have a very simplistic view of negotiation. In the UK, it's quite common to find people believe that negotiation equals compromise. Somebody starts off asking for 100, somebody starts off asking for 50, we're going to reach 75 as the compromise. It's the British weakness. It's probably how we've come to lose so much in the negotiations over Brexit. But the reality is it's only one way of negotiation. And if the person you're negotiating with believes that you are going to compromise, it encourages him to start off with an exaggerated posture in the belief that he'll end up somewhere in the middle. What's required in negotiation is the ability to be fluid, to recognize that sometimes a negotiation will be a form of compromise. Sometimes it will be give and take. Other times it will be trying to overcome a power differential, or maybe an exercise in logic, or even creative thinking. And the successful negotiators tend to recognize this fluidity as a key part of negotiation when they're thinking about negotiation plans and strategies. In terms of planning, we've had to overcome an awful lot of misconceptions around negotiation. A former colleague of mine, Dr. Brian Farrington, used to say publicly that for every hour you're going to negotiate, you need to spend 8 hours planning. I wonder how many of you have a full day that you're able to put aside when planning for a 1 hour negotiation. Fortunately, another guru on negotiation, a guy called Neil Rackham, did some splendid work which identified that whether you're an average negotiator or a really successful negotiator, the best negotiators don't necessarily spend longer planning. It's all about how they use their time that makes the difference. Now, I have to be honest, if you're negotiating a 2,000-page contract with a customer or with a supplier, you may well need to spend a lot of time getting to understand the issues and consider the alternatives. But at its heart, I do believe that planning for negotiation is more about focusing on key activities rather than necessarily spending a lot of time, much of which may well be wasted. Again, what we find is that the organizations and the individuals that plan well for negotiation have structure, templates, processes in place to make sure that they cover the key issues. When it comes to control, there's a simple saying in the UK, which is the dog wags the tail. The tail does not wag the dog. And what this means is in negotiation, it's really important that somebody on your team actually understands how to take control of the negotiation. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute that this should be like an interrogation with one party totally in control, but somebody needs to understand how to make sure that you're getting the negotiation to move in the direction you want it to move, rather than losing ground here. If we look at relationship at the bottom, as I said a few minutes ago, I think most of us negotiate over the long term with key clients, key customers, key suppliers, key stakeholders. And the idea of tricks, or the idea of using power, or the idea of any sort of short-term gain through being manipulative just doesn't sit comfortably as part of a long-term relationship. And so, as well as the approach and planning and control, what we found working with these 12 organizations was a strong belief that the relationship should be a key part of how we negotiate if we want to be successful. And I have to link that to the final issue, which is achievement. You know, sometimes you find people are very, very comfortable in forming relationships with people because they tend to give in. And of course, what we're looking for is people who have a long-term, a well-developed relationship, but they use the relationship to achieve their goals and objectives. It's not simply about being a nice guy and conceding. It's about seeing the relationship as an asset that can be used in negotiation and using it the right possible way. Now, when we get to the masterclass in Amsterdam in March, we're going to break this down into a lot more detail. We're going to explain in detail what things like BATNA are. the difference between people who take interests as key in negotiation rather than people who take positions. We're going to explain the power of vivid openings and so on. But if you want a shorthand way of understanding what these 12 organizations have identified as being the perfect negotiation, you need to just look at the questionnaires that you went through and look under level 4, where we've identified what the accomplished negotiator does against each of these activities. And I just stress this by saying the idea of number 4, the accomplished negotiator, is to give you an opportunity to benchmark yourself against what these 12 organizations believe are an accomplished negotiator's characteristics. Just for a moment, if I ask you to focus on example number 1, and we'll talk about how you would actually interpret this or read it. Clearly, this guy has got some strengths. I hope you're listening, by the way. Very strong relationship strengths. You can see everything from feelings commentary, which is not negotiating like a robot, but explaining to somebody why something's important, and even down to things like using apologies as a way of pouring oil on troubled waters and keeping the negotiation flowing, thanking somebody when they make a concession, even if it's a small one. This is somebody who's receptive and encourages the other guy to come up with ideas and suggestions, and is sensitive, perhaps able to focus on things like the body language. But there are clearly some gaps. I guess if you're looking at this at a macro level, there's not much red in the area of achievement, nor is there much red in terms of approach, nor is there much red in terms of control. So this is somebody whose mental model of negotiation is perhaps a little bit naive. It's a little bit one-dimensional. This is somebody who builds great relationships with people, but doesn't necessarily use those relationships as a lever to get more out of the negotiation than he could. And again, not necessarily somebody who takes control of the agenda, or somebody who asks lots of searching questions, or somebody who tests to make sure that he understands what the other person is saying, and not necessarily somebody who summarizes frequently. You've got here somebody who doesn't necessarily take a great deal of control. So in the masterclass, what we're going to do is help somebody like this to understand what they can do to build on the skills that they have and become an even better negotiator. Gosh, nearly 25 minutes gone already. If we look at example number 2, there's even more yellow and even less red. I wonder if you'd be able to read this for me. You know, at a superficial level, this is somebody who doesn't do a lot of planning, somebody who doesn't believe in relationships, somebody who has a very simplistic approach in terms of what negotiation is, but somebody who thinks certain key activities are very important. A BATNA, having an alternative. If this is a procurement guy, this is somebody who believes in competitive quotations and playing one off against another. This is a guy who likes to open the negotiation strongly, asks questions, tests understanding, summarizes. Very, very focused on what he wants, believes in using power, using time to advantage. It's very easy to see this as some sort of bully. I have met a similar example in a major pharmaceutical company, and it happened to be a chief executive. And when we actually talked about the fact that he didn't do much planning, his view was, I don't have to, I'm the chief executive. I have people who do that for me. And when we talked about the lack of emphasis on relationships, he said, I don't have to, I'm the chief executive. I have people who do this for me. So as long as we're talking about somebody who's part of a negotiating team, it's okay to have gaps. As long as when the team is put together, you have people who are particularly strong in planning or relationship building to cover for the weaknesses that this individual would have. And if I use example number 3, just to try and explain that, this is a guy who clearly has got a lot of strengths in planning for a negotiation. You can see he has a strength in BATNA, understanding what alternatives he has. He understands the need for creativity, and he focuses on genuine interests, not taking positions. Legitimacy is about making sure that he's only asking for things which are realistic, and he's not going over the top and aiming too high. Lots of good planning strengths, right down to planning the agenda, but it seems to be that when the guy gets into a negotiation, the planning has gone well, but it doesn't necessarily translate into giving him control in the negotiation. He doesn't seem able to use the relationship as a way of getting achievement. His approach to negotiation, again, is perhaps one-dimensional. But, you know, if you take example number one, where the profile author was very strong at relationships, and you get that guy to work with this guy who's very strong in planning, you can see how a strong team could come together if you cover all the bases from people within the team. I have to say that my first thought when I saw this profile was this is either an accountant or a project manager, somebody who's a great believer in planning. As we run through this, guys, we get to number 4. Again, there's an awful lot of yellow. This again was a pharmaceutical example. It's from somebody who I hope is listening. I know from what was put on the form that this guy is in procurement. It's not an uncommon procurement profile to find people focusing on, do I have competition? Do I have a BATNA? And people who don't these days have enough time for planning. You typically find that between a buyer and a seller, the seller has more control skills than the procurement guy. But this guy is very strong on, again, he's focused, likes power, understands different techniques of persuasion, uses power very, very strong. The final example, if I may, is not an uncommon example where there are no really strong peaks. What you have is a mix, generally speaking, between 3 and 2. So this is somewhere between somebody who's aware of what good negotiating looks like and is perhaps a good practitioner. Not too many examples of outstanding issues in particular. What this suggests is that there is somebody who's a general, all-round, capable negotiator, but with some opportunities for improvement. And what we've found with the profile generally is people are often quite keen to identify a particular development plan having done this. And what we always recommend is doing too much or trying to do too much is counterproductive. Really, it's better to think about maybe 3 or 4 activities and try and work on them over 3 or 4 negotiations rather than trying to do too much. Again, all we really hope for with the profile is that people see it as an articulation of what an accomplished negotiator looks like and some way of measuring how they stack up against that benchmark. We've done a number of studies of how effective the profile is. Over 2,000 people have actually completed the profile. And when we've gone back to something like 200 of them, we've got very high validity scores where people have commented that now that they reflect on it, they do see why they've ended up with the profile that they actually have. So the idea of the profile is really to help you guys understand what the opportunities for improvement may well be. Of course, you can always do it the Trump way. Final slide, and then I'll throw it open for questions if I may. We are going to put together a masterclass which will be held in Amsterdam in March time. And we're going to deal to some extent with some of the issues that come out of the negotiation profile, but we're also going to be dealing with some particular questions that might be relevant to you. For example, I said earlier, it's not how long you spend preparing for a negotiation, but it's how you can use what time you have effectively. So when we're together in Amsterdam, we're going to be talking about how to best use half an hour or an hour, if that's all you have before you go and negotiate with a customer. We're going to spend some time talking about the most commonly made mistakes in negotiation. We've called these common human failings. Some of them are very basic. Some of us don't like asking questions. Some of us don't get body language. Some of us tend to make assumptions. There's a whole raft of issues that we're going to explore and come up with approaches for actually dealing with them. We will spend some time building on the work of a number of people, a guy called Hofstede in particular, who looks at the way that our cultures have evolved and what the evolving cultures mean for our behaviour in negotiations. And again, many of you may have experience of dealing with Middle Eastern cultures, African cultures, Far Eastern cultures, North European cultures, all very, very different. Sometimes even within countries you will find different cultures, as you will find in Spain at the moment, between those who believe they're Spanish and those who believe they're Basque and those who believe they are Catalan. You'll find the same issues in the UK, between Scotland, England, and so on. But we're going to talk not just about national cultures and how to prepare for dealing with different nationalities. We're going to talk about cultures that come from companies. So the difference, for example, between British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, two major international airlines, but with very different cultures and very different behaviours in negotiations. Often we find engineers, accountants, pharmacists, people have a view that negotiation is an exercise in logical persuasion, but the reality is logic doesn't always work in negotiation. Emotion plays a large part. We're going to talk about how you negotiate when you've got little power, and are there specific techniques for dealing with difficult people in negotiation?
I think we're out of time now, so I think we should leave the webinar there. Many thanks, Eric, for a really interesting presentation, and thank you everyone who attended today.
Thank you.